I found out my father had sold the farm from a scrap of yellow paper about mending a fence, tucked inside a glossy auction catalogue with his own front paddock staring back at me off the cover. What that catalogue didn't say, what nobody said aloud for another 3 weeks, was that he'd signed his own life away with someone else's hand wrapped around his, over a cup of tea he'd had no reason not to trust. My hands weren't shaking. I want to be clear about that, because everything that came after makes more sense if you know I was calm, in the way a man is calm right before he does something he can't take back. I was standing in the Council Depot car park, still in my high-vis, when Barb from Records handed me the envelope that had come to the office by mistake, some mailing list mix-up, my name still listed under the old surveying contract I'd done for the Shire years back. I opened it leaning against the Uda. Cattle yards. 240 acres. Circa 1904 homestead. Motivated vendor. Tucked between page 3 and 4, like someone had used it as a bookmark and forgotten it there, was a sticky note. Bright yellow. Rhonda's handwriting, all loops and underlines. Remember to fix the fence in the holding paddock before 2. VIP buyers coming through. Don't you dare track mud up the veranda. Not sorry. Not we need to talk. A chore list. For a farm I didn't know was for sale. I read it 3 times, waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They didn't. Dad hadn't called. Dad always called, even when it was nothing, even when it was just to complain about the price of urea. I checked my phone. Nothing since Tuesday, and Tuesday had just been him asking if I still had his good drenching done. I got in the Uda. I didn't ring Rhonda. I didn't trust my voice yet. The drive out to the farm takes 40 minutes if you don't hit roadworks past Kingaroy, and I did every one of those minutes in silence, windows down, the smell of servo coffee going cold in the cup holder and red dust already ghosting the dash from the last time I'd been out here, which, I did the maths in my head, because that's what I do when I can't afford to feel anything yet, had been 11 days ago. 11 days, and somehow in that time the whole place had gone up for sale like a second-hand Uda. Nothing prepares you for seeing your childhood home staged like a display village. The veranda where Mum used to shell peas had been swept bare. The good armchair, the one with Dad's shape worn into it after 40 years, was gone. Some real estate stylist had put a bowl of decorative lemons on the kitchen table, the kind nobody eats, and it made the whole kitchen look like it belonged to a stranger practicing being a family. That's when I saw the hat. It was sitting by the wheelie bin near the shed, upside down in the dirt like it had been tossed rather than placed. Dad's a Kubra. Sweat stained through the band, one side of the brim gone soft and floppy from 40 summers of being shoved on and off, 1,000 mornings of him checking the sky before he checked anything else. He never went anywhere without it. Not to church, not to the doctor's, not even, Mum used to joke, into the shower. I picked it up. Knocked the dust off against my thigh, slow, the way you'd brush dirt off something that used to be somebody. There was a rip near the crown I didn't remember being there before. I carried it back to the Uda like it was something that could still bruise, and I laid it on the passenger seat, brim up, the way Dad always sat it so it wouldn't lose its shape. I found Rhonda in the kitchen. Of course she was in the kitchen, it was the only room in the house that still looked lived in, because it was the only room she'd needed to keep functional while she gutted the rest of it. She had a mug of tea going, steam curling up past her sunglasses, which she was wearing indoors, which was a thing she'd started doing a few years back around the same time she started saying words like self-care without a trace of irony. You didn't fix the fence, she said, like that was the headline of the morning. Where's Dad's chair, Ron? In storage. Everything's in storage. She took a sip. Didn't even look at me properly. The agent said empty rooms photograph bigger. Where's Dad? That's when she finally turned around, and I watched her decide, in real time, which version of herself she was going to be for this conversation. She picked the tired one. The martyr. She does grief like other people do makeup, carefully, and only where it shows. Declan. Sit down. I'll stand. She sighed like I was the unreasonable one, opened the drawer under the phone bench, the drawer that used to hold rubber bands and dead batteries and now apparently held legal paperwork, and slid a folder across the table at me. Enduring power of attorney. Dad's signature at the bottom, the loop smaller and shakier than I remembered but unmistakably his. Clipped behind it, a letter on a GP stationery, dense with words like diminished capacity and progressive cognitive decline. "He's not well," she said. "You know he hasn't been well. He rang me Tuesday about a drenching gun." That's exactly it, isn't it? One good phone call and you think everything's fine. You don't see him on the bad days, Declan, because you're not here on the bad days. I am. Her voice cracked, right on cue, like a light switching on. This farm was going to bury him in debt. I'm doing what has to be done so he can actually be looked after properly. So don't you dare stand there in your counsel boots and judge me for making the hard calls. I looked down at the letter again. At the date. At my father's shrinking signature. Something in my chest didn't believe a word of it, and I've learned over 14 years of reading survey pegs and title boundaries that when a number doesn't sit right, you don't argue with the person holding the tape measure, you go and measure it yourself. "Where is he?" I said. "Right now. Riverbend. The good one." "I'm not a monster, Declan, whatever you're thinking behind that face of yours." I didn't answer her. I picked up my keys and I walked out past the lemons nobody would ever eat, past the swept veranda, and I didn't look back at the house because I already knew what I'd see, a for sale sign where a childhood used to be. Riverbend Aged Care smelled like every aged care facility smells, antiseptic laid thin over something sadder underneath. I found Dad in a day room that faced the car park instead of the garden, slumped a little in a wheelchair he'd never needed a fortnight ago, his eyes doing that slow, underwater blink that told me before any doctor could that someone had been feeding him more than his blood pressure tablets. "Deck," he said, and it took him a second too long to land on my name. Then, before hello, before anything else, "Did anyone milk the girls this morning?" The girls. His dairy herd. Sold off, I'd find out within the month, 6 weeks earlier, quietly, while I was none the wiser. "They're right, Dad," I lied, and pulled a chair up close enough that our knees touched. "You're right as rain." "I never signed anything," he said, suddenly clear, gripping my wrist with a strength that didn't match the rest of him. "Whatever she's telling you. I never signed away that farm." I looked at the brass compass I still carried clipped to my belt loop out of habit, the one I use on job sites when the GPS unit's flat, the one Dad gave me the day I got my surveying ticket. I turned it over once in my fingers, the way I do when a boundary doesn't line up with the plan. Because that's the thing about my job. I spend my whole working life finding the places where what's on paper and what's on the ground don't match. And standing in that day room, with my father's hand shaking around my wrist and a signature on a legal document that looked like his but wasn't quite the hand that used to hold a fencing tool steady for 40 years, I understood, with the same cold certainty I get when a boundary peg is sitting exactly where it shouldn't be, that this wasn't confusion. Somebody had moved the pegs. I wasn't going to fight my sister with shouting. I was going to do what I always do when something doesn't add up. I was going to survey it. The land titles portal doesn't care whose family you belong to. That's what I like about it. Numbers don't perform grief for you. So on Thursday night, after a full shift out resetting boundary pegs on a subdivision near Nanango, I sat at my kitchen table with a beer going flat beside the laptop and pulled every document with my father's name on it going back 5 years. The enduring power of attorney had been lodged on the 14th of March. I stared at that date until it stopped looking like a date and started looking like a key. I cross-referenced it against the Rural Finance portal, the one I still had access to from doing Shire drought mapping work, and there it was, sitting in the repayment schedule like it had been waiting for me, the drought relief subsidy loan, the one Dad had taken out 3 years back to get through the bad seasons, had its annual renewal paperwork due on the 13th of March. One day before. Rhonda did that paperwork every year. Dad trusted her with it because numbers made his eyes glaze over and hers didn't. I didn't know yet what it meant. But I've spent 14 years learning that when two dates sit that close together, It's not a coincidence, it's a seam. Someone stitched two documents together and hoped nobody would look closely enough to see the thread. My phone lit up before I'd even finished the thought. Rhonda, you need to bring Dad's Medicare card back. The nursing home needs it for his file. I hadn't taken his Medicare card. I texted back saying so. Rhonda, whatever. Just drop by tomorrow. We need to talk about the auction logistics. Caterers, parking, that sort of thing. Me, I'm not helping you sell the farm, Ron. 3 dots appeared and disappeared 4 times before her reply came through. Rhonda, it's already happening whether you help or not. Don't make this harder than it has to be. I put the phone face down on the table and finished the beer, and then I didn't sleep much, because somewhere between the dates on my laptop and the tone of her texts, something had started tightening in my chest that felt less like anger and more like fear. She rang me the next afternoon, and this time there was no steel in her voice at all. December. Her voice was wet, thick, the kind of crying that either costs a woman everything or costs her nothing depending on who you ask. I can't do this without you. Do you understand that? I am so tired. I have not slept properly in 4 months. I'm the one who drives out there twice a week. I'm the one who sat with him at the hospital when his sugar crashed in June. Where were you, Declan? Where were you when I needed? I was in Toowoomba doing a job. Ron, you know that. I came the second. You always have somewhere else to be. A shuddering breath. And now I finally do the hard thing, the thing nobody else was brave enough to do, and you swan in and act like I'm some kind of criminal. Do you know what that letter from the doctor cost me? Emotionally? Watching some GP write words like decline about our father? Then why not just tell me? Before it went to auction. Why a sticky note, Rhonda? Why did I find out from a real estate catalog? Silence down the line, half a second too long. Because I knew you'd react exactly like this, she said, sharper now, the tears drying up fast as they'd come. Emotional. Sentimental. Standing in the way of what's practical. He told me he never signed it. He also told the nurse last week that Bob Hawke was coming round for tea, Declan. He's not well. I know that's hard to hear. I hung up before I said something I couldn't walk back. I sat in the Uda in the depot car park with my hands on the wheel and I did the thing I do instead of crying, which is nothing, completely still, staring at a fixed point on the dashboard until the feeling passes far enough under the surface that I can drive again. Uncle Ray rang me 2 days later. Dad's younger brother, a man who'd sat at every Christmas table of my life and never once, to my memory, taken a side on anything. That should have told me something before he'd even said hello. Mate, he said, I heard there's been a bit of biffo between you and Rhonda. Did she ask you to call me? A pause that answered the question better than words would have. Look, Dec, I'm not getting in the middle of it. But she's worried sick you're going to do something you regret. Contesting things legally, going to the paper, whatever it is you're cooking up out there. She just wants what's best for your dad. Ray. She sold his cattle without telling him. He can't run a herd anymore, son, you know that as well as anyone, that's not the point. My voice came out harder than I meant it to. The point is nobody asked him. Nobody's asking him anything anymore. Family's hard, Ray said, in the voice men use when they want a conversation to be over. Don't let this turn into something you can't undo, that's all I'm saying. Rhonda mentioned your work with the council, said something about a conflict of interest if you go digging through land records for a family matter. You want to be careful about that. People can lose jobs over less. That last part sat in my gut like a swallowed stone the rest of the day. It wasn't a threat, not the kind you could point to and call a threat. It was worse than that. It was a threat wearing someone else's voice, delivered by a man who loved my father and didn't even seem to notice what he'd been made into. I found the spa on a Tuesday, not because I went looking for it, but because I drove past it on the way to drop equipment back at the depot and something made me slow the Uda right down. Serenity Day Retreat, Rhonda's dream, realized it said on the sandstone sign out front, gold lettering, a water feature running even though the whole district was 2 years into water restrictions. I rang Graham that night. We'd done our surveying apprenticeship together 20 years back before he went into accounting, and he still owed me a favor from when I'd helped him move house 3 times in one bad year. Public record stuff only, mate, he said down the phone, keyboard clicking in the background. I'm not doing anything dodgy for you. Just tell me if it's in trouble. The clicking stopped. Mate, he said slowly, this thing's carrying about $320,000 in commercial debt. There's a default notice from the bank filed 11 weeks ago. If she doesn't refinance or find a lump sum inside, he did the maths out loud, call it about 8 weeks from now, they're going to move to repossess the whole building. 8 weeks. The auction was in 3 days. I sat in my driveway with the engine off for a long time after that call ended, my father's Acubra still sitting on the passenger seat where I'd left it, and I understood, with a coldness that frightened me a little, that this had never been about drought debt or dad's care or what was practical. This was about a hole in my sister's finances the exact shape of 240 acres. But knowing why didn't tell me how. He'd signed that paper himself. I'd seen his own hand on it. I found Dr. Whitlam on the golf course, because that's apparently where a man goes to hide from questions he doesn't want to answer. Rhonda's made from way back. They'd done a charity 9-hole together every second Sunday for years, which I only knew because Dad used to complain about her borrowing the good esky for it. He wasn't happy to see me between the 7th and 8th holes. Declan. This isn't really the place, it'll only take a minute. I kept my voice level, the way I do on site when a landholder's furious about a boundary and shouting won't move the peg an inch either way. The day you assessed my father. The 14th of March. Was Rhonda in the room the whole time? I'm not able to discuss a patience, was she making the tea? He went very still over his putter. I want to know, I said, quiet now, whether my father was in any state to understand a single word of what he was signing that day, or whether somebody made very sure he wasn't. That's a serious thing to imply, Declan. It's a serious thing that happened, Doctor. I'm asking you to tell me which version of it you were part of. His jaw worked for a second. He looked past me toward the clubhouse, toward nothing, toward an exit that wasn't there. He was very drowsy that day, he said finally, each word coming out like it cost him something. Unusually so. I remember thinking it at the time. He could barely hold the pen. Rhonda had to guide his hand for part of it. He straightened up too fast, gripping the club like a life raft. That doesn't mean anything on its own. Elderly patients have off days. Off days, I said. I have to finish my round. He was already walking. I stood on that manicured green with my father's compass turning slow circles in my closed fist, and the shape of the thing was almost whole now, almost close enough to touch, except for the one piece I couldn't make myself look at directly yet, the T. The drowsiness. The hand that had to be guided. I drove straight to the nursing home instead of going home. Dad was asleep when I got there, mouth open, hands loose in his lap like a man who'd stopped fighting something he didn't know he was fighting. I sat beside him for an hour without waking him, turning the compass over and over, and somewhere in that hour the fear in my chest turned into something colder and steadier, something with an edge on it. The auction was in 2 days. Whatever had happened in that kitchen on the 14th of March, I was going to need more than a hunch and a compass to stop it going any further. I drove into Toowoomba that same night with the spa's default notice printed out, Graham's number scrawled on the back of a council work order, and Dr. Whitlam's words replaying in my head on a loop I couldn't switch off. She had to guide his hand. I found Marion Pratt above a shop front near the old post office, a solicitor who did nothing but elder law and had a reputation, according to the bloke at the servo who'd once used her for his own mother, of being about as gentle as a barbed wire fence. She read everything I put in front of her without once looking up. When she finally did, there was no softness in her face at all, and I was grateful for that. "This isn't confusion, Mr. O'Connor," she said. "This is what we call undue influence and financial elder abuse, and if what your GP source described actually happened, sedation, guided signature, a fabricated capacity assessment timed to a finance deadline, then what your sister did isn't a family disagreement. It's a crime. She was already reaching for the phone. I can have an urgent injunction before the Supreme Court by tomorrow morning. It'll be tight. But we can stop that gavel. I didn't sleep that night either. I sat up with the compass on the kitchen table in front of me, turning it slowly under the light, and for the first time since the sticky note, I let myself cry, quiet, and finished with it inside 20 minutes, the way I do most things. The morning of the auction, the holding paddock was full of Range Rovers. Rhonda stood near the veranda in a silk dress the color of bone, a flute of champagne sweating in her hand, dabbing under her eyes with a tissue for an audience of real estate agents and neighbors who murmured to each other about what a hard road it must have been for the poor woman, having to let go of her father's legacy like this. She'd rehearsed her grief the way she rehearsed everything, and it very nearly worked, right up until the moment I walked through the gate in the same Blundstones I'd worn every day of this whole business, mud dried into the seams, a folder under my arm. She saw me and her face did something complicated and fast before it settled back into sorrow. "Declan," she said, loud enough for the crowd, "I really don't think today is the day for one of your—" The agent was already up on the small platform they'd built by the fence line, tapping the microphone, calling for opening bids. He got as far as "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll open the bidding yet," before Marion Pratt walked straight through the middle of the gathered crowd in a charcoal suit and held up a document that caught the morning sun. "This auction is suspended, effective immediately," she said, under an interim order of the Supreme Court of Queensland. The silence that followed had a texture to it. I heard, very distinctly, the champagne flute slip in Rhonda's hand and click against her rings. 2 police vehicles came up the gravel drive not 30 seconds later, tires throwing dust across the very lawn where the caterers had set up their little folding tables of finger food, and I watched every one of those Range Rover owners find urgent reasons to be somewhere else. The police weren't there about a land sale. They said the words administration of a substance, financial abuse of a vulnerable person, deprivation of liberty in the flat, procedural tone police use for things that are anything but flat, and Rhonda's face came apart in front of the whole district, the silk dress and the tissue and the grief all falling away from something much plainer and much colder underneath. "You ungrateful bastard," she spat at me, mascara running now for real, no performance left in it. "You have no idea what I sacrificed for this family. No idea. I did everything for him. Everything." I didn't answer her back. There wasn't anything left to say that would land, and I'd learned enough these last 3 weeks to know that some people don't hear you until a court does the talking for you. I just turned the compass over once in my pocket and watched her being walked to the car, and there was no triumph in me at all. Only a tiredness so deep it felt like it had roots. I didn't stay to watch the crowd disperse or listen to the agents mutter into their phones about postponed settlements. I drove straight to Riverbend with the emergency guardianship revocation Marion had pushed through in the same frantic overnight filing, and I signed my father out of that place myself, at the front desk, my hand steadier than it had any right to be. Dad was dozing in the day room when I came to get him, and when he opened his eyes and saw me standing there, something in his face cleared the way the sky clears after a front moves through, slow at first, then all at once. "Are we going home, son?" he asked, and it wasn't a confused question. It was the clearest thing he'd said to me in 3 weeks. "We're going home, Dad." The truth of it, the whole shape of what she'd done, came out over the following days in pieces, the way these things do, through Marion's calls and the detective's careful questions and, eventually, through Rhonda's own solicitor trying to negotiate a lesser charge. There'd been no forged signature at all, which was almost worse, somehow, than if there had been. She'd simply crushed 2 sleeping tablets into his tea that morning, the good bone china cup he only ever got for visitors, and slipped the property transfer in among the drought subsidy papers he signed every March without much of a second look, guiding his hand across the one line that mattered while he sat there fogged and trusting and calling her a good girl for looking after all this paperwork business. The capacity letter had come after, dressed up to explain away a drowsiness she alone had caused, so that nobody, least of all Dad, would ever think to ask why he couldn't hold a pen that particular Tuesday. She hadn't needed to forge anything. She'd only needed him to trust her. We didn't talk about any of it on the drive back to the farm. Dad sat with the window down, working his jaw the way he does when he's turning something over and not ready to say it aloud yet, and I let him have the quiet. The paddocks came up green after the rain we'd had the week before, and somewhere past the second cattle grid he asked me, out of nowhere, whether I thought the bank would let him buy a few new heifers once things settled, and I told him I reckoned they would, and that was as close as either of us got to talking about what she'd taken from him. The house was still half-staged when we pulled in, the decorative lemons still sitting in their bowl on a kitchen table that didn't feel like ours yet, but the sold sign was gone from the front gate, pulled up that morning by the same agent who'd been so keen to plant it a fortnight ago. Dad got out slow, one hand on the door frame, and stood a moment looking at the shape of his own front paddock like a man checking a boundary line against a memory of where it used to sit. I reached across into the Uda and took the Akubra off the passenger seat, where it had ridden the whole 3 weeks of this, brim up, dust settled soft into the sweat line the way it always used to when it lived on his head instead of a car seat. I turned it once in my hands, working the crown back into shape where the rip had let it sag, and I stepped up beside him. He didn't ask for it. He never would have thought to ask, that wasn't him. So I just reached up and set it on his head myself, the way he used to do to me when I was 7 years old and too short to reach the hat stand, tugging the brim down gently until it sat right, until it caught the glare of the afternoon sun and threw a familiar strip of shade clean across his eyes. "There you go, old man," I said. He tipped his chin up under the brim, squinting out at the paddocks that were still his, and for a long moment neither of us said another word, because there wasn't anything left that needed saying. It was all sitting right there on his head, worn soft and holding its shape, exactly where it belonged. Some mornings now I still catch myself checking the wheelie bin out by the shed before I've even walked past it, some leftover habit from that day, half expecting to see something of his tossed there again like it never mattered. It never is. The bin's just a bin now. But I check anyway, and I don't know when I'll stop. Dad wears the Akubra every day again, same as he always did, and if you didn't know to look you'd never clock the mend along the crown where I worked the shape back into it with my own thumbs that afternoon in the driveway. He doesn't talk about the 14th of March. Not once, not even when Marion rang about the committal date, not even the day the spa went up for mortgagee sale and half the district drove past slow to have a squiz at the empty water feature. He just goes quiet for a bit, the way he does, working his jaw, and then he asks me something about the heifers, or the rain, or whether I've had my Uda serviced, and I answer him, and that's the whole conversation. That's as far in as either of us go. I still carry the compass on my belt loop out of habit more than need these days. Most jobs I've got a GPS unit that does the same thing faster and better. But there's something about the weight of brass in my palm when a boundary doesn't sit right that a screen can't give me, some old certainty I trust more than any satellite, and I doubt I'll ever leave it in the Uda again. Some evenings I drive out just to sit with him on what's left of the veranda, the good armchair back from storage now, worn into his shape again inside a week like it had been waiting the whole time too. He doesn't say much on those evenings. Neither do I. We just sit there while the light goes long and red across the holding paddock, him in his hat, me still in my work boots, and every so often the wind gets up under that soft, mended brim and he reaches up without even looking, the same automatic motion he's made 10,000 times before, except now, every time I watch him do it, I know exactly which line along the crown was stitched back by hand, and exactly whose hand did the stitching.